we're going to launch into our recap, which we cut out of the podcast and host separately on YouTube for your viewing convenience. So if you find yourself just on that recap video and want to hear our full thoughts and discussion, it'll be linked in the description box below. But without further ado, let's dive into episode 64 of Campaign 3, Reunited. So we pick back up this time with Team Wildmount, who, if you remember when we last left them a couple months ago, the last thing they had done was just attempt to teleport from Laesmere to Drusar. And I do say attempted because this does not go well. If you'll recall, Laura had to roll a D100 when she tried to teleport, and we were left on the cliffhanger of her reacting to that roll. Presumably it was bad, and we find out that it was bad. So in this attempted teleport, everyone takes a chunk of force damage, and they basically are still caught in the liminal space between spaces. They're like still within the teleport. So she rolls again, and again rolls low. So they take even more force damage and are still stuck. So she then rolls a third time, this time with guidance from Deanna, and they are pulled through the ether and eventually plopped out into Exandria. Except they're not in Drusar. They're on the edge of this cliff and notice that there's this wave of Arakoa flying at them. Or excuse me, Eusphora? Is that what they call them?
Aesfera, I think.
Aesphora, thank you.
Yeah.
I might just say Arakoa because you get it, bird people.
Yeah.
So they're flying at them with spears and armor, and the party's like, whoa, we come in peace, we come in peace. But they swoop down, throw nets over the party, and entangle basically everybody but Chetney and FCG. And then what follows is basically some pleading and some explaining with more bad rolls from Imogen, with them basically saying, you know, it's an accident that we're here. Like, we're just trying to leave. And what basically happens is the Arakoa decide to blindfold the party and fly them away from here so that they don't, the blindfolds so that they don't know where they are, because they're very hush hush about this place. They don't want outsiders here and they don't want anybody to know where they are. So the party agrees to those circumstances, get blindfolded, and get flown away and dropped off at the bottom of the mountain in a forest. So after all of this and during all that kind of chaos, FCG has reached the brink of going, you know, seeing red, going berserk. And there is a couple of calm emotion spells that are thrown off to kind of keep this at bay, and they're successful in doing that. But once they've now landed at the forest and the bird people have left, FCG's like, I got to go into stasis, basically. And they can't teleport again because the staff that Imogen is using has charges, and she does not have enough after failing earlier. So they're like, okay, let's just, you know, sleep here, camp here, and try to teleport again in the morning. One interesting thing, though, is Frida kisses FCG, and this actually removes his 2 stress points. So
Right.
The immediate threat is dissipated regardless. So the party rests here, and the only thing that really happens this night, even though it's not night, is Frida uses detect thoughts on FCG's sleeping body. And what he picks up is this intent, this rage, and this intent to kill and destroy and cleanse. And the only other images between that rage that Frida picks up are flashes of someone building FCG. And the delicate craftsmanship that has gone into it, and just this intent burning within FCG for this rage. But Frida isn't sure if this is programming or if this was like a virus. So morning comes, they attempt to teleport again. This time Imogen rolls a 53. And so they're ripped through space and time, and they actually arrive in Drusar safely. But it is the middle of the night here due to the time zone change. The first thing they noticed are that the magical lights here are diminished, similar to Uthadern, and they can tell that the solstice had its effect here as well. And they're trying to decide where to go. So Deanna actually casts Scry on Laudna to see if they can see where they are, and it is successful. And she sees that Laudna is in a cave of some sort, but that she's okay. So Imogen then tries to sending spell to Laudna, but is unsuccessful. So they then decide, let's go talk to Pretty at the Sentence Well and see if, the rest of Bell's Hills have been by, if he has any information. So they head there. Pretty is fetched for them, and Pretty basically catches them up on the things that have been going around. There were celebrations for the solstice, but since then things have been a little off, a little weird. The moon's been acting up, and now half the gondolas in the city have stopped working, and a bunch of armies have arrived in city, and he hasn't heard from the rest of Bell's Hells. So the party leaves, and they can tell there's lots of soldiers about in town from all sorts of militaries, not just Drusar, and the skyport full of ships. So as they head to the core spire, they realize the gondola here is down, like Pretty said, and there's a long line of people basically waiting to get sent over the gap on a small floating platform that's kind of being run by the city. So they're like, we don't want to wait in this line. So they kind of cut ahead and show the credentials from the king and queen of Uthadern, like saying that, hey, we have important business to discuss in the core spire. Like, we need to go first. This works. So they are allowed to cut the line, and they all get on this disc, which is called a broom skipper. But Fern has to polymorph into a raccoon dog in order so they can all fit. But they all get on, get to the other side, and decide to head to the Spire by Fire next. Once inside, the Qatari owner of the establishment recognizes them, tells them, I have not seen your friends either. So they decide, well, let's just settle in, get some breakfast, and figure out what our next move is. And as they're doing that, a lot of soldiers come into the tavern, and the Qatari owner tells them that, yeah, most of the inn has been kind of taken over as a temporary barracks. And Frida recognizes some of these soldiers again are being represented from all over, including the Clovis Concord and the Council of Taldore. And so they're just trying to figure out, okay, like, what exactly is going on? What's the response here? But meanwhile, Imogen tries another sending spell, this time to Zidana, and it works. And so she asks, like, have you heard from Laudna, and are you okay? And Zidana's fine, but she hasn't heard from Laudna. So Chetney goes over to the table of soldiers and tries to get some information out of them, says, like, hey, like, who's coordinating the efforts? Like, how can we help? And they said, we're just following orders. We got here a couple days ago. A warder then comes by and tells Chetney, like, hey, go speak to the quorum if you're looking for information. Like, we're here on military business. Like, these people can't answer your questions. So at this point, Fern, who is still polymorphed, goes over to another table to eavesdrop. And there's this half-orc soldier that's telling his comrades that, like, hey, I know it's strange here, but just follow orders, watch each other's backs. We're going to be marching soon. And as the party is settling in, getting their breakfast, we cut to elsewhere in the city where a tree begins to glow and open. And that's where we go to break for the first half.
Yeah, great job, man. So coming back from the break, we find the party of AOL, Team AOL from Asilra arrives in Drusar through this portal opening up in the Lucent Spire in a public park. And if you remember, the Lucent Spire is kind of like the bougie, noble-esque spire of Drusar. And the party emerges from it. Prism a bit surprised. Hey, you're here. Again, picking up on that last episode, Prism not realizing they were going to the same place. They make some small talk about, like, oh, so this is Drusar, and kind of talking about, like, what to do next. They know they want to get more information about what's been going on, specifically Predathos, and they float the idea of actually going to the Starpoint Conservatory, which, if you remember way back early in Campaign 3, this is where Imogen and Laudna were originally trying to get into to learn more about Imogen's powers, and also where they found out about the study about Imogen's mom and the red dreams people were having. Orem points out that, hey, we barely found out about Predathos from, like, some heavily redacted documents that people were on the run with. I don't know if we're going to find out more there about Predathos. But even so, Prism is really excited about the idea of finding some banned books, and more importantly, talks about this persona moving forward of just basically, hey, if I lie and say I'm a high-ranking mage of the Cobalt Soul, will you guys all play along with me? And Ashton's like, yeah, just make sure you don't start with the fact that you're lying. Just try to own it, okay? And there's also some funny dialogue around, like, what's the training like at the Cobalt Soul? And Prism does reveal that she has an 8-pack, apparently, which I think Emily Axford is sticking to. This is canon now for Prism. The party then decides, okay, well, where should we go? And Orem basically says, hey, If our friends are here, they would be at the core spire, at the spire by fire. So let's head that direction. They head to one of the gondolas. This one is still working. And as they arrive on the gondola, they not only can see the distant red beam of Ruidus, that's sort of like held in the distance in, like, I think Matt describes a like permanent flaring state of it as well. But there is I think it was like a small goblin who gets on the gondola with them. Or maybe it was a gnome. I can't remember.
Yeah, I think it was a gnome. Yeah.
Who is a courier of some kind. And the person's kind of minding their own business, and they want to kind of like figure out like what's going on in town. So Laudna, in very creepy Laudna ways, sits right next to him and is like, hey, like what's going on here? Like what's been happening? Totally freaks this person out. Somebody cast friends on the courier, but fails. And Orem is really, you know, typical Orem dad is really kind of trying to like, guys, just be normal. Like, let's stop freaking out this guy. They don't get much information other than the fact that a lot of strange things have been happening. People are a bit restless. It's not unlike some of the chatter we got from Uthadern. And I don't remember if we found it out from this person directly, but we also find it at some point that as we found out in Uthadern, that teleportation circles are not working, certain enchantments are not working, though teleportation magic does seem to work. They arrive at the core spire. The courier runs away. Prism sends, I think, either Mother or Danios to chase after to figure out, like, who is this person really? And Matt's like, it's a courier. Like, please leave him alone. The party makes their way to the Spire by Fire. They do note the massive military presence. Will mentioned how the skyport was filled up with sky ships. I think the mention was that even like the nearby mountainside was covered with like parked, with docked sky ships as well. And they spot a number of different, not nationalities, forces represented here.
Yeah.
Not just from Vasselheim, but they also see the insignias of the Council of Taldore, and they also see an insignia of the Changebringer as well. They note this and head into the Spire by Fire, where they are gleefully reunited with Team Wildmount. It's very satisfying. It becomes a very large table with 10 people all huddled together, lots of hugs. And just skipping through some of the longer portions, there's a lot in this section of what happened to you? You know, and then I think friends like, we had a threesome, and they're like, oh, okay. And then, you know, we had someone from the Ruby Vanguard who tried to kill us. And so this is a good chunk of conversation. But more importantly, there's a lot of introductions, a lot of swapping notes, and the party essentially decides, okay, I think we should get back to Marquette. We should get back to that excavation site. Clearly something's happening there. Deanna, meanwhile, is going to sneak away and cast communion because she wants to talk to the Dawnfather and figure out what should our next move be. Remember in the previous episode with her team, the Dawnfather had charged her with, hey, you must go stop what's happening, and seemed to imply, or you're going to lose like your gift of resurrection that when I brought you back to life. So she casts communion. She sees sort of like this visage of the Dawnfather, and she asks 3 questions. The first one being, essentially, are Bell's Hells trustworthy? Like, are they more dangerous than they are helpful? And the Dawnfather doesn't give an answer. It seems like the future's a bit uncertain there. She also asks about the Dawnfather's followers, and specifically, like, are your people doing religious colonialism? I guess I don't know what to call it, because she had been told the story of the town that the Isilra team had to basically save from the Dawnfather temple, essentially.
Hearthdale, yeah.
Hearthdale, thank you. And the Dawnfather basically gives kind of a cliche, like, you know, my followers do what must be done. And then Deanna says, final question, are you worth saving? Which makes the Dawnfather so angry that he just thrusts her out of the communion spell, much to Deanna's dismay. It's also around this time as they're swapping notes that there's conversation around Hearthdale and it being a nexus point, and specifically how many nexus points are there around Exandria. And Matt explains that although the apogee solstice moves them and sometimes creates new ones and we lose old ones, that best guess is that across Exandria there are 23 nexus points. And then lastly, the party is essentially talking about what do we do next. And this is kind of like some conversation around, it's like the story reasons to sort of exit Deanna, Frida, and Prism from the show, for at least in the short term.
Mhm.
And they basically decide, if we're going to do this well, if we're going to get back to Marquette and stop lewdness, we need more information. So Deanna, Frida, and Prism agreed to kind of go together and possibly go to Vasselheim and try to get more information on all these things that have been happening so they can be kind of like a source of info to feed to Bell's Hells. There's a great moment of FCG being like, well, I'm going with Frida, obviously. And Frida being like, no, like you have to stay here. And then FCG's like, well, you can come with us then. And it was just really great, like back and forth of like, even though these actors have to move on, of course the characters would want them there.
Yeah.
So they do ultimately, FCG agrees to stay with Bell's Hells and Frida will depart and see them soon. Though FCG is suspicious of Prism, mostly because Prism has a bird as a companion, which they don't very much appreciate. One last thing that does happen as we're wrapping up our recap, Deanna is asked by Orem, as they're talking about the different insignias that they saw of like the different armies. Orem asks Deanna, hey, can you check in on a friend of mine? Can you check in on Keyleth? And pulls out the, which I love that this came back because I thought it was totally discarded. The messaging seed that he had been gifted. This was all the way back from EXU season 1, but it had sort of wilted after the message from Keyleth had gone through. He presents it to Deanna and says, hey, can you scry on Keyleth for me? And Deanna does scry and essentially sees Keyleth in her chambers back in Zephyra, hobbled and recovering from her injuries, and notes that despite it having been a couple of weeks, her slashes still appear to be extremely fresh. And there are aides around her who are pretty much like, you have to rest, you have to save your strength. And all that to say, that is essentially what happens in this episode 64 of Campaign 3 of Critical Role Reunited. And don't forget, if you're checking out just our recap, you can see our whole discussion. We want to know your thoughts as well. Click the link in the description and you can jump into our dialogue.
Bada boom, bada bing. Well done, man.